In every industrial age, we go through periods of revolution and periods of incremental improvement, where the needle that marks our expectations moves. These are the products or advances that shift public expectation of an existing market. Canning foods like baked beans was a revolution in food storage.
The next big advance was the tin can, the brainchild of an Englishman named Peter Durand.
Adding pull tabs to the top of the can was an improvement in convenience. Now, if we pivot that conversation away from general life and towards motorcycles, these points are small but genuinely great. I'd call heated grips, fuel injection, electronic ignitions, cruise control, or good off-road ABS as things you might put in that category. And if we drill down a little more and look at actual bike models, the T7 and the KTM 890 are two recent bikes that are easy to point at. Now, in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to try and explain why I think the CF Moto 450 MT is probably the next bike to do this. I don't know a ton about CF Moto. My knowledge is kind of something like this. China, KTM engines, builds some KTMs, makes a ton of ATVs. Now that's messy, so I figured it was time to do a little actual journalism, some research. I mean, I Googled it, I read more than a single Reddit thread, and then I just tried a different web search because Google was actually pretty bad at this. To understand it a little, let's roll back the clock. It's 1989, a time of change, walls falling down, leather jackets, big hair, and the release of Michael Keaton's Batman. In China, the 1980s was a time of transition as the country moved through a cultural revolution. Perms started appearing, discos were a thing, and the country was experiencing a rapidly improving standard of living. In a southwest coastal city, a father and son started a small motorcycle spare parts and repair shop for second-hand bikes. The details of what happened with CF Moto are pretty hard to come by. Even digging into the depths of Chinese language, Chinese alphabet, internet, leaves a very vague trail. Now, by 1992, it seemed they were making decent business gains. They had their first aftermarket cylinder head for a 125 scooter, and within 5 years came their first full liquid-cooled engine. Now, since the mid-90s, they have been on a journey of impressive development. Going from spare parts shop to bike manufacturer is a big enough leap. In 2013, they became the official KTM importer into China. That relationship blossomed when they entered a joint manufacturing venture with KTM in 2017. They also listed on the Shanghai Stock Exchange that very same year. In 2024, you'd be mistaken to think of CF Moto as a small brand. 2023 was a record revenue year, and in terms of size, they're just a smidge behind KTM with 1.4 billion Great British Spondoolies of turnover. The largest share of the company still sits with the founder, Lai Guoji, and his son. And from there, the company ownership looks exactly the same as you'd expect a listed company to look. Some high-level executives and a collection of funds and investment firms with their own complex ownership structures. The more I dug into this, the more boring and overwhelming it got. Now, there is always the question in YouTube comments around government ownership in China, and that's a very difficult one to answer, as there isn't a clean ledger of what the government own and what they don't, at least not that I can figure out. So, back to the motorbikes. The CF Moto KTM relationship is an interesting one. That joint venture I mentioned, well, it seems to have been a pretty significant milestone. It's not to be confused with the KTM relationship with Bajaj, the Indian motorcycle giant. Bajaj physically own a huge stake in KTM. That deal also opened up the whole Indian market to KTM, and that's how we ended up with the 200s and the 390 KTMs. The CF Moto venture is different, and it does seem to have different goals. KTM have been able to open up their own brand to Chinese production, which we've now seen in the 790 Adventure models. Visually, those bikes seem identical to the European-built bikes. That venture is a split ownership between KTM and CF Moto, and the key here is that they share production, they share some parts and knowledge, but they're still both separate companies. Just recently, CF Moto announced a very similar arrangement with Yamaha. What it means is you get bikes like the 800 MT that use the KTM 790 engine, but you also get models that are distinct, like the 450 MT, and that distinctness is why the 450 MT is a bike that moves that needle of expectation. Also, the CF Moto part appears to translate as spring breeze. That's a little more fun than basically any European brand names apart from Triumph. By now, you should know we've got to do the disclaimer part. This is a press bike and was provided to us by CF Moto UK. I kept it 100% stock for this test. Normally I'd swap to a control tyre, but this is a budget bike and I didn't want to stick £200 worth of tyres on here and declare it great. It's too far removed from the point of the bike. I popped a Krieger US 40 on the back to carry my stuff and decided to be very careful about crashing it as we didn't have any Outback Motortech crash bars yet. They are coming soon, but they're not here. On top, this review is conducted without riding the Royal Enfield Himalayan 450. Everyone will want that comparison and I can't give it. There's a perception of the budget end of the adventure bike market that these bikes are mostly for beginners or small riders or just people without a lot of money, but they're a stepping stone to something bigger, better and more capable. I don't think that opinion is unfair. I would argue that a lot of the small adventure style bikes we've had the last few years haven't been designed for the Western market. We adapt to them, but the majority of the big players are from the Indian market, bar the CRF 300 Rally. The 310GS, made by TVS in India for the Indian market. KTM 390 and 200 models, you guessed it. The Royal Enfield, well, that goes without saying. They have some great qualities. They are a bucket load of fun, but they're really quite different to the bigger adventure bikes. And I'm not talking about the size of them. I'm talking about the design ethos and the end goal. The enduro that has been sprinkled across most brands' middleweight adventure bikes does not exist here. Even in the KTM, the 390 Adventure is not the same ideology as the KTM 890 Adventure R is. A Himalayan is really a bike for getting you where you need to be. A BMW 310 GS is a similar version of that, the KTM 392 and the CRF 300 Rally is a converted farm bike. We just made a video about that. And while none of this is a bad thing, they can all be great fun to ride, none of them do this well. You probably won't see a clip of Adam Ryman fully sideways around his farm on one because that's what they don't do very well, and that's fine. The new Enfield carted him around India and a 10-year-old one carted me around the Himalayas. That's where you can start to see the separation of the 450 MT in this category. Its use case, the intention of it, is different. It's a bike with that little bit of European, Japanese style influence, and the end result is it's really different. Now, in the last few years of testing bikes on my home patch, I've grouped together some trails that tell me a lot about a bike. Trails that provide great insight into suspension, engine, grip, and off-road setup. This first hill is covered in square-edged rain gullies, and a soft, spongy bike clatters through them so hard your ancestors feel it. A vague bike feels terrifying on the damp chalk patches. An unbalanced bike makes feeling balanced in your riding position really tricky. Easily the best bike on this trail to date is a KTM 890 Adventure R with WP Pro suspension. It was magical, balanced, and it felt like it was made for that trail. And I'm going to say this very clearly and slowly. The CF Moto, with its decently spec'd KYB suspension, was good along these trails. The chassis and the handling was solid, safe, comfortable, balanced and consistent. And that's a lot of adjectives in a single sentence. But really, it's what I think an adventure bike should feel like. The riding position was great, even for me as a taller rider. It felt natural and intentional and not like a compromise. The more I rode it, the more that feeling flooded around this bike. It is designed to be ridden standing up in a Western riding style, a style born out of riding enduro and motocross bikes. I was able to push the envelope more and more, get sideways, do jumps, and flow down the trails at a really enjoyable, mile-crunching pace. Now, earlier this year, I did 6 days on a Royal Enfield Himalayan 411, and that was not possible. This was not possible. The controls and the overall execution of the bike also add up to this. The brakes are solid and functional. They're not high-spec Brembos, but they're not total wooden crap. The clutch is light but not lacking feeling, and the throttle feels decent. There was some flex in the plastic, but we're nitpicking here. The TFT feels familiar and is easy and functional, and the little ABS traction control on-off switch is literally superb to use.
One button here. Done. Off-road mode. ABS off, traction off. What more do you need to... Like, why does Yamaha... Triumph, come on, like,
It feels like a mid-sized adventure bike resized in Photoshop. It's 10% smaller, but it's the same thing, the same idea, just slightly shrunk. I think you might be getting the vibe that I think the CF Moto is a good bike. And I do. It is. But I think your expectations here are going to play a big part in whether it works for you. A lot of that starts with the engine. The 450 motor is solid. There is a smoothness and efficiency and ease of use, but it's also unremarkable. It's a little quicker revving and has slightly lower inertia than some of the singles, and sits probably somewhere between a KTM 390 and a 310 GS. There are very few negative quirks to the power delivery or performance, and it'll ride at UK road pace very easily. You do have to rev the motor. It's not going to drag you along with a bucket load of torque. It simply doesn't have that kind of power. It has enough to work comfortably, but no more. And when we dive into the detail, the CF Moto is exactly that. Everything on the bike works as it needs to, and does no more. It's really not let down anywhere by any part of its design, and that's kind of why it's so good. On road, it handles with a similar character to most 21-inch modern adventure bikes. I think it'd make a very pleasant weekend street bike and a lovely commuter. I'm not going to set lap records on it, but I can ride it quickly. The riding position is comfortable, the seat height lowish, the weight lowish, and visually the build is solid. It doesn't look super cheap, and it doesn't look like the components are outrageously high end. It doesn't really have a weak point. The weakest point of the whole package is the CST tyres that are similar in design to Pirelli and Scorpion STRs, and that's a tyre I really don't like anyway. On a side note, I did puncture the front tyre and have to perform a roadside repair. The carcass really seems quite soft on them. It's the kind of bike that if you test ride for 30 minutes or an hour from a dealer, I don't think you're going to understand. I've seen the same thing with the Aprilia Touareg. It'll be fine. It'll maybe even be a touch underwhelming, but that's not where the CF Moto shines. It shines in having very little downside. It is solid at every single thing you need it to be solid at, and it has no quirks. It is the motorcycle equivalent of homogenized milk with really good suspension and handling. If milk could have suspension and handling, not the best analogy. When you take a bike that handles on and off-road like we want an adventure bike to handle, scrape some weight off the top, lower the seat height a touch, and then put it into the market with a price tag of £6,000 and no real discernible downside, I think it starts to make quite a lot of sense. After all, there aren't many bikes that don't have some really annoying quirks. Maybe the user interface with the electronic aids is frustrating. Maybe the suspension is a bit too budget or just way too soft. Maybe they're a little bit overweight. They have some weird corners like the foot pegs that have been cut, or they have tubed wheels. CF Moto, from the outside at least, seem to have ridden every middleweight adventure bike, picked the good stuff and put it in their budget adventure bike. The TFT is a bit KTM. These panels are a little Tenere World Raid, and the styling is a little Husqvarna Norden. There is a lack of identity about it, but it's the lack of identity that gives you such a well-rounded end product. The lack of innovation is the innovation. It's all the good R&D put into a single package. The battery is accessible. The airbox is accessible and relatively high. The engine has a T7 style sacrificial frame for mounting sump guards, and the subframe is a separate piece. The pillion pegs are undermounted, the mirrors folded inwards easily, the screen can be adjusted with either hand on the fly, and it comes with a basic toolkit. I mean, it's even got a USB-A and a USB-C port. There isn't a part of this bike where it feels like it wasn't considered. The main oversight that I found is the manual rear shock preload adjustment. The most important thing about this bike is to understand what it is. It is not the same kind of bike as all the other small adventure bikes currently in the market, but rather a smaller version of the bigger adventure bikes, and that distinction is incredibly important. It does adventure bike things really well, having a good balance of road handling, highway performance, and off-road handling, but it has the same limits as one of those bikes too. It's still a biggish bike with some weight to it. It's not a dirt bike disguised as an adventure bike, it's an adventure bike. You're going to get on well with this as a technically good rider in the same way you might a Touareg 660 or a T7. If you ripped all the badges off this and asked me who made it, I'd probably say it feels as close to a mini Aprilia Touareg 660 as anything. I saw a headline from MCN that it was like a mini Tenere, but I think that's a little lazy and a little clickbaity. It's not a mini T7 because actually I think it's better than that. The UI is better, it's got tubeless wheels, and you don't have to buy a much more expensive version to get decent suspension. Shade thrown. But that is the entire win of the CF Moto 450. It does what the more expensive bikes do for less money and less size. It does what KTM did in the early years of their existence. You get what appears to be a T7 Extreme or a World Raid spec suspension for a fraction of the cost. It reduces the excuses mainstream brands have for glaring issues in their premium models. ABS and traction control that is subpar or hard to switch off, awkward riding positions and shitty suspension. They're being outdone by a bike half the price, and I also think it significantly raises the ceiling of what we can expect a small capacity or budget adventure bike to be. Whatever you think of that, the end consumer only stands to win. So if you made it this far into the video, I reckon we might have an event that you might be interested in. It's called An Evening of Dakar, and we run it at the Bike Shed in central London. It's on the 28th of December 2024 this year, so if you are watching this after that, it's already happened. The idea of the evening is that it's a little celebration of the Dakar Rally. So we have a beautiful little gallery of bikes that you can check out all the way from 79 to 2025. We run 5 20-minute masterclasses so that you can learn a little bit more about how the Dakar works and how rallies work. And then we premiere our Dakar film. This year, we went to Morocco to recreate the 1979 Dakar in all its glory. Once that's done, as if that wasn't enough, we also then have an evening-style talk show hosted by the Trail and Adventure Motorcycle podcast, Clive and Noel, and they sit down and talk through the history of Dakar and some incredible stories by our incredible guests. It's a great evening. If you're interested, there's links in the description below where you can get your tickets, and hopefully we'll see you there.